I used to believe that honesty was a shield, a sacred barrier that protected a relationship from the rot of deceit. I was wrong. Sometimes honesty is just a carefully crafted mask worn by a man who knows exactly how to hollow you out from the inside. Julian told me once that the truth would set us free, but all it did was bind me to a ghost I never asked to meet. My husband-to-be always said his ex-wife would always be part of his life, and that if I didn't like it, I was free to walk away. At the time, I thought that was maturity. I thought it was strength. I didn't realize it was an ultimatum designed to silence my instincts before our life together even began. The shimmering lights of San Francisco always felt like a promise of something better, a glittering landscape where ambition and romance collided in a high-altitude dance. I met Julian at a high-end tech networking event where the air was sharp with the scent of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of tech ambition. He stood there, a silhouette of success against the floor-to-ceiling glass of a skyscraper that seemed to pierce the very heart of the bay. He was a software architect, a man who built complex systems, and I should have known even then that he was already designing mine. He didn't play the games other men played. There were no hidden silences or vague excuses. By our third date, as the fog began to swallow the city like a heavy silver curtain, he handed me his truth like a poisoned chalice. He spoke about Sienna. She was his ex-wife of 8 years, the woman who had occupied the space I was now stepping into. He said their split was amicable, a gentle drifting apart like two ships in calm sea. They were still friends, he claimed, and they still shared coffee to catch up on the lives they once built together. He called it a sign of maturity, an evolved way for two adults to coexist after the romantic fire had died down. He told me that cutting someone out after nearly a decade was immature and cruel, and that he valued his history too much to erase it. I fell for it. After years of being ghosted and discarded by men who fled at the first sign of emotional depth, Julian's openness felt like a sanctuary. I thought I had finally found a man who was secure enough to acknowledge his past without letting it haunt his future. I admired his loyalty to a woman he no longer loved, seeing it as a blueprint for the kind of man he would be for me. I was so blinded by the light of his supposed integrity that I failed to notice the shadows stretching out behind him, long and cold. 6 months into our whirlwind romance, the dream took a physical form when I moved into his modern penthouse. It was a masterpiece of steel and marble, perched high above the city streets with views that could take your breath away. The kitchen was a dream of professional-grade appliances, and the living room looked out over the shimmering lights of the bay. It felt like the beginning of a fairy tale, but every palace has its secrets, hidden in the floorboards. I spent those first few weeks trying to merge my world with his, unaware that the foundation was already compromised. I was organizing a drawer in the guest room when I found them. Photos. They weren't on the walls or displayed on the mantle, but they were there, tucked away in a leather-bound box like a heart still beating in the dark. Julian and Sienna in Japan. They were standing beneath a canopy of cherry blossoms in Kyoto, their faces flushed with a joy that looked eternal. Another showed them huddled together in a small ramen shop in Tokyo, laughing at a joke I would never understand. There was a raw, unfiltered intimacy in their eyes that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just history. It was a haunting. There were shots of them in Hakone, their bodies pressed together in the steam of a hot spring, and candid pictures of Sienna laughing, while Julian looked at her with a devotion I had never felt from him. When I showed them to him, Julian didn't flinch. He just shrugged, his expression as smooth and unbothered as the marble countertops. He told me it was just clutter he had forgotten to clear out. He said he had been meaning to move those old boxes to storage for months, but simply hadn't found the time. He kissed my forehead and told me I was the only woman who mattered now, dismissing the evidence of his lingering connection with a casual wave of his hand. He said I was being sensitive, that his past with Sienna was just a closed book with a few loose pages. He used his logic to make me feel small, to make my valid concerns seem like the whispers of a paranoid mind. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. But as I stood in that beautiful, cold penthouse, I felt the first hairline fracture in the foundation of my security. I had moved into his home, but Sienna had never truly left. Her laughter was etched into the walls, and her presence felt in the heavy silences between his phone calls. Julian had invited me into his life, but he had left the door open for someone else to walk through whenever she pleased. I was standing in the center of my own dream, realizing that I was only a supporting character in a story he had already written with another woman. This was the beginning of the broken trust, a slow and agonizing erosion of the marriage I thought we were building. This is the reality of a Reddit relationship story that no one warns you about. The truth doesn't set you free. It just prepares you for the fall. I was living in a penthouse of glass, and I could finally see the cracks beginning to spread. The shimmering high of our engagement began to fade the moment the reality of the planning set in. Julian had knelt on one knee at the very tech gala where we met, surrounded by the elite of San Francisco and the glittering promise of a shared future. The applause had been deafening, and in that moment, I believed I was the center of his universe. I believed my marriage would be a sacred bond, a fresh territory where only the two of us existed. I was wrong. The proposal was merely the curtain call for the woman I used to be and the opening act for a three-person nightmare I never saw coming. 2 weeks into our engagement, the first cracks appeared over a quiet breakfast. Julian looked at me with that calm, logical gaze that I once admired and told me that Sienna should help plan the wedding. He said she had impeccable taste and knew every high-end vendor from their own time together. He argued that it would save us tens of thousands of dollars and ensure everything was perfect. He called it a gesture of maturity. I felt a cold, jagged knot of unease tighten in my chest, but I swallowed my protest. I wanted to be the evolved partner he praised. I didn't want to be the insecure girl who feared a ghost. The intrusion was swift and surgical. We spent weekends in Napa Valley, a place of rolling vineyards and golden sunlight that should have been romantic, but instead felt like a battlefield where I was unarmed. We walked into luxury wedding boutiques where the air smelled of expensive lilies and silk. Every time I reached for the white orchids I had dreamed of since I was a young girl, Sienna was there to steer me away. She insisted orchids were temperamental and common, pushing for lilies instead because they were timeless. Julian didn't look at me. He looked at her. He nodded when she spoke, his eyes reflecting a deep-seated respect for her opinion that he seemed to have lost for mine. The erasure became total when we visited the venue. I wanted something new, something that belonged to us alone. Instead, Sienna led us to a stunning waterfront estate in Napa, the very place where she and Julian had exchanged their vows 7 years ago. She touched the stone pillars with a familiarity that made my skin crawl, talking about how the light hit the altar at sunset. Julian was captivated. He said the space was efficient and beautiful. When I finally found the courage to speak, telling them both that I didn't want to get married in the shadow of his past, the atmosphere turned frozen. Julian didn't comfort me. He didn't take my hand. He gripped the steering wheel of the car as we left and told me I was being immature. He said my jealousy was exhausting and that I was sabotaging our future over petty insecurities. He told me that if I truly loved him, I would appreciate the help of a friend who only wanted the best for us. The gaslighting was so smooth, so professional, that for a moment, I actually wondered if I was the problem. I felt the broken trust rattling in my bones like a fever. By the end of the month, I realized I was no longer the bride. I was a guest at a ceremony meant to celebrate my own disappearance. I was the stand-in, the physical body meant to wear the dress, while Sienna directed every heartbeat of the event. Julian had stopped seeing me as his partner and started seeing me as a project to be managed. Standing on the balcony of our penthouse that night, looking out at the indifferent lights of the city, I felt a deep, hollow ache in my soul. My marriage was being built on a foundation of lies and lingering attachments. I was being erased from my own life, and the man who promised to protect me was the one holding the eraser. The quiet girl who wanted to be cool was dying, and in her place, a cold, sharp clarity was beginning to take hold. I was done playing the role of the insecure fiancé. I was ready to become the woman who burned the script, The silence of the penthouse felt like a tomb that night, heavy and suffocating. I had come home early, my head throbbing with a migraine that made the moonlight feel like needles against my eyes. I expected to find Julian sleeping, but instead I found a ghost in my kitchen. Sienna was standing there, pouring a glass of water, bathed in the cold blue light of the open refrigerator. But it was not her presence that stopped my heart. It was what she was wearing. Wrapped around her thin frame was the oversized, gray University of Chicago hoodie. The one Julian told me he had lost 2 years ago. The one he said his father bought him on his move-in day. He had claimed to be heartbroken when it went missing, calling it his most sentimental possession. Seeing it draped over her shoulders felt like a physical blow to my stomach, a violent violation of the history he had promised to share only with me. Julian walked in a moment later, freshly showered and smelling of the expensive cologne I bought him for his birthday. His eyes did not find mine first. They found her. He did not apologize. He did not even look guilty. When I demanded to know why she was in our home wearing his clothes, he stepped in front of her, shielding her from my gaze. He told me I was being dramatic, that she had simply found it in a box of old things and was feeling cold. In that moment, he chose her comfort over my sanity. He chose his ex-wife over his future bride. That was the moment the marriage died, long before the first vow was ever spoken. Later, as he slept with the peaceful, unbothered rhythm of a man who believed he was untouchable, I sat in the darkness of the living room with his iPad. My hands shook so violently I could barely type in the passcode. But the digits I had memorized in a moment of past trust now served as the key to my destruction. The betrayal was not a single moment. It was a sprawling digital map of deceit. I found the messages first. Months of hourly conversations that bled with an intimacy I had never known. They spoke of the life they were still living together, the hidden touches and the secret laughs. He told her he only stayed with me because I was stable and easy to manage. He told her his heart would always belong to her. The husband infidelity was laid bare in high definition, but the worst was yet to come. I opened the banking app, my breath hitching as I scrolled through the transfers. $3,000. Every single month, like clockwork, Julian had been wiring $3,000 to Sienna to pay her rent. It was the exact amount I had been meticulously contributing to our joint wedding fund. My savings, my sweat, and my dreams of a future were being funneled into the pocket of the woman who was systematically dismantling my life. Then I found the photos from 3 months ago. Julian had told me he was in Seattle for a grueling 4-day tech conference. He had sent me tired texts about back-to-back meetings and bad hotel coffee. The photos told a different story. He was in Aspen. The mountain peaks were capped with white, and the sun was golden on their faces as they sat on a ski lift, their legs intertwined. There was a video of them dancing in a cabin, Julian looking at her with a raw hunger that made me want to scream. The affair was not a mistake. It was his primary reality, and I was just the background noise. As the city lights flickered outside the window, something inside me grew cold and hard. The pain was still there, a jagged edge cutting through my chest, but beneath it, a new fire was beginning to burn. I was not just a victim of a cheating husband anymore. I was the architect of my own escape. I would not scream. I would not cry. I would be as silent and as systematic as he had been. He thought he had won. But he had no idea that I was already planning to take back everything he had stolen from me. This betrayal was complete, but my survival was just beginning. The sunrise over San Francisco was a cruel, brilliant gold, but I felt nothing but a frost settling in my marrow. The woman who had cried for Julian was dead. She had perished somewhere between the $3,000 rent payments and the photos of Aspen. My grief had crystallized into a silent, lethal clarity. I did not scream when he left for work that morning with a kiss that tasted like a lie. Instead, I began the systematic deconstruction of the life he thought he had stolen from me. I was no longer the victim of a betrayal. I was the architect of its end. I started with a private investigator, a man whose eyes were as hard as the lenses he used to document Julian's husband infidelity. I paid him in full to shadow the man I once loved, to capture the dinners in hidden bistros, and the late-night entries into Sienna's apartment. Each time-stamped photograph was a nail in the coffin of our relationship. I didn't just want the truth, I wanted a record that could never be erased. While Julian was out playing the part of the devoted friend, my investigator was documenting the reality of his double life. Then came the phone calls. Each one felt like a surgical strike. I called the florist in Napa Valley and told her the wedding was no more. I called the caterer and the band, their voices filled with practiced sympathy that I didn't need. I reclaimed every single deposit, every dollar I had funneled into a dream that was actually a nightmare. With every cancellation, I felt a weight lifting off my chest. I was dismantling the stage Julian had built for his masquerade. By the time I reached the venue coordinator at the waterfront estate, my voice was steady, cold, and absolute. There would be no lilies. There would be no vows. There would only be the sound of a contract being torn to shreds. I sought out a lawyer who specialized in the wreckage of broken trust. We sat in a sterile office, going over the evidence of his financial fraud. That was when the most delicious irony revealed itself. Julian had insisted the lease for our luxury penthouse be in my name only, claiming it was better for his investment profile and future mortgage applications. He thought he was protecting his assets, but he had actually handed me the power to evict him with a single signature. He had built his kingdom on my land, and I was about to reclaim the territory. He had used my credit and my stability to anchor his life, never realizing that an anchor can also be a dead weight when the ship decides to sail. While Julian was busy working late with Sienna, I began the relocation. My best friend helped me pack the valuables, the jewelry, and the pieces of myself I had brought into that cold marble space. I found a small, sun-drenched apartment in Oakland, a place with old wooden floors and windows that looked out over a neighborhood that felt real and grounded. Moving my things felt like an exorcism. Each box carried out of the penthouse was a fragment of the ghost of our marriage being purged. I left the furniture he liked, the art he chose, and the lies he told. This was my silent exit. I was moving through the shadows of our home, invisible and methodical. Julian still believed he was in control, still believed he was successfully managing 2 women and 1 grand deception. He had no idea that the foundation was gone. He was standing on a trapdoor, and I was the only one with my hand on the lever. This wasn't just a Reddit relationship story about a woman scorned. This was a masterclass in reclamation. I was no longer a guest in my own life. I was the one who owned the keys, and I was about to lock the door behind me forever. The divorce was already living in the silence of the empty closets. I was gone before I even walked out the door. The air in the penthouse was thick with the scent of rosemary and roasted garlic, a domestic perfume that masked the smell of a dying relationship. I had spent hours preparing Julian's favorite meal, herb-crusted salmon with a reduction of balsamic vinegar. I wanted every bite to be a reminder of the devotion he was about to lose. I wore a silk dress the color of midnight, my movements fluid and precise, a sharp contrast to the trembling girl I had been only weeks before. Julian sat across from me, sipping an expensive vintage wine, his face relaxed and arrogant. He still believed he had successfully balanced his 2 lives. He still believed I was the stable, easy-to-manage bridge to his respectability, while Sienna remained his secret heart. He smiled at me, a gesture of hollow affection that used to make my heart flutter, but now only made my skin crawl. As we moved to dessert, a simple lemon tart that he had once praised for its brightness, I did not bring out plates. Instead, I placed my phone in the center of the table. I hit play on the recording I had saved from 2 weeks prior. The room was suddenly filled with the sound of his own voice, low and intimate, whispering to Sienna about how he was only going through with the wedding because he could not hurt me yet. He told her that she was his true home and that I was just a temporary necessity. Julian's face did not just go pale. It turned a ghastly shade of gray. The fork in his hand clattered against the fine china, a sharp, dissonant sound that signaled the end of his masquerade. He opened his mouth to lie, to weave another web of gaslighting and manipulation, but I held up a hand to silence him. The power in the room had shifted. I was no longer a character in his script. I was the one who had burned the theater down. I told him calmly that the wedding was over. I had called every vendor 10 days ago. The orchids were canceled, the band was dismissed, and the waterfront venue in Napa had already been rebooked for a couple who actually valued their vows. Every cent of the deposits I had paid was back in my private account. I watched the realization sink in, the sheer panic of a man who had lost his grip on the narrative. Then I slid the engagement ring across the table. It tumbled with a hollow, metallic click, a tiny diamond tombstone for my marriage that never was. I revealed the final blow. The lease for this very penthouse was in my name alone. I had already spoken to the landlord, and the termination was signed. He had 30 days to find a place for him and his ghost to live. I walked out of that apartment without a single tear, leaving him standing in the wreckage of his own deceit. The aftermath was a storm of his own making. I sent the private investigator's report to his family, a digital folder of his husband's infidelity and the thousands of dollars he had stolen from our future to pay Sienna's rent. His parents, people who valued tradition above all else, turned on him with a cold fury that left him truly isolated. Julian and Sienna did marry eventually, a rushed and joyless ceremony at a courthouse with no white orchids or Napa sunsets. But their victory was a poisoned one. Broken trust became the third member of their marriage. Sienna, knowing exactly how Julian had cheated on me, spent her days drowning in paranoia. She began calling his office every hour, accusing him of affairs with his new assistant, living in the same hell of suspicion she had helped create for me. They had each other, but they had no peace. A year has passed since I walked out into the cool San Francisco night, and I am finally thriving in a life built on solid ground. I am in a relationship with Liam, a man whose honesty is not a mask but a foundation. He is transparent and kind, a person who understands that the past is meant to be learned from, not relived. We sit in a small garden in Oakland, drinking coffee in a silence that feels safe and full of light. I realize now that my divorce from the woman I used to be was the most important step I ever took. I survived the betrayal and the cheating husband to find the one thing Julian could never give me: my own worth. I am whole, I am happy, and for the first time in my life, I am the only one holding the keys to my heart.